So our panel speakers are very renowned experts in their fields, and I wanted to just briefly remind you of who our speakers are before I hand over to the first of these. So if each of the speakers wants to use the Zoom wave function or just wave at the screen when I mention you, that would be brilliant. So first, we have Professor Anand Menon, who probably needs no introduction these days, since most of you will have seen him at one point or another on the BBC, talking about all things Brexit and the UK and UK politics. He's the director of UK in a Changing Europe, and also Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London. Also from UK in a Changing Europe, we have Professor Tim Bale, who is their Deputy Director, and he is also Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University in London, and is an expert on political parties and the politics of immigration. We have our own Richard Whitaker, who is actually the former director of the Parties, Parliaments and Public Opinion Research Cluster here at Leicester, and is an expert on the British Parliament, the European Parliament, loads of other parliaments all around the world. He is our parliaments expert, most definitely. And we also have Dr. Alex Wadden, who is an expert in social policy here at the University of Leicester. And my own area of expertise is in the topic of public opinion, especially topics like attitudes to immigration, attitudes to European integration, and political trust. So all things that are very relevant to the Brexit situation. So I'm going to first hand over to Anand, who I believe is going to summarize in very broad terms kind of things where things stand at the moment in terms of our full exit from the EU, and possibly say a few things about the impact of Brexit and the COVID-19 situation on British politics, again, broadly speaking. Anand, if you could remember to unmute your mic when you start talking.
Hope you can all hear me. Thanks, Lauren.
Yep, great.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk mainly about where things stand with regard to this issue of whether or not we're going to extend transition, so whether or not we're really going to leave the single market and the customs union at the end of this year. The deadline for asking for an extension is the 30th of June. And my first point, I suppose, is that the 30th of June is a serious deadline. You don't hear the phrase very often, but Article 50 actually provides a remarkable amount of flexibility to a state that is leaving the European Union. And one element of that flexibility is this rather remarkable ability to say, actually, we need more than 2 years. We need to extend this transition period, and you can do it by a very, very quick sort of shortcut procedure. The simple fact is there is no way of extending transition without formally extending transition. You'll read a lot of people saying, well, the EU always finds a way, the EU can be very flexible. None of those people, as far as I'm aware, have actually specified anything like a mechanism by which transition could be extended if we decide to do it after the end of June. And the problem is, if we decide after the end of June, let's imagine we get to October and the economy is doing very badly post-COVID, and we decide actually we need to keep this transition going. There are only two ways that we can do anything like it. Firstly, we can come to an agreement with the European Union, i.e. a kind of deal that says let's extend transition. The problem with that is that deal is going to have to be almost certainly ratified in all member states. It'll be a very clunky, very slow process. The other way is if the European Union turns around and says we can offer you some mitigations to help sort of lessen the impact of ending transition, but unilateral EU mechanisms can be withdrawn whenever the EU wants. And again, will not cover the full range of single market and customs union membership that transition does. So point number one is the deadline is a serious one, because if we don't ask for an extension before the end of June, we're not going to get anything that looks like transition from the end of December. So where are we in the debate? Well, firstly, there are those, and I'm among them, who would argue that COVID-19 strengthens the case for an extension. Firstly, because if Boris Johnson ever needed a force majeure argument for doing what he said he would never do, the pandemic is that force majeure argument. Secondly, in terms of the economics, extending avoids piling one more economic hit onto the one that COVID is already wreaking on our economy. And this isn't necessarily, I think it's worth saying, about whether or not we get a deal. I don't think the point of extending transition is primarily about it making it easier to get a deal. And I say that partly because I'm very skeptical as to whether a deal is going to be achievable, even if we had 5 years, simply because both sides have dug in around red lines that are fundamentally incompatible. And, not to put too fine a point on it, the British government is not acting as if it wants a deal. If the British government was serious about having a deal by the end of the year, it would not be going about these negotiations in the way it is. Notably, it will be addressing the things that the EU has said it has to talk about before we can talk about trade, which basically means fish. The point about having an extension is to spare businesses the need to adapt for a second time, having had to deal with the adaptation required by COVID. It would also give the British government time to prepare, because one of the things that's happened as a result of COVID is a number of people who were working on no deal preparations or on Brexit have been shifted within Whitehall to working on COVID. So no deal preparations are slowing down. In many areas they've stopped. DEFRA simply doesn't have the staff to do that anymore because they're so preoccupied by COVID. In other sectors of the economy, if you think about pharma, firms have already said, if we have a no-deal Brexit, we will need to stockpile. Those same firms are now saying we can't stockpile for a no-deal Brexit because we're stockpiling for COVID. We simply don't have the warehousing capacity to prepare for no deal on top of that. So there is, it seems to me, a pretty strong economic case for extending transition to spare businesses the additional hit of adapting to a situation where we're outside the single market and the customs union. Politically, Tim's got a really nice piece on our website today in which he makes the point that actually, for all the fact that the Conservative Party is quite Brexity in Parliament, the Prime Minister still has the latitude to decide. He has pretty much unrivaled personal authority, the Prime Minister, at the moment. And of course, Catherine Barnard has argued that he doesn't even need to pass a law for all the stuff about the fact that the transition date is enshrined in primary legislation. The withdrawal agreement bill that passed in January actually gives the government a way of circumventing that legislation and deciding essentially by prime ministerial fiat. So that's the case for extending. The case for not extending rests on several legs, some of them more solid than others. The first couple are economic. So Brexiters will say we have to not extend because we need to be free to make our own regulations, which we can't do under transition, that will allow us both to deal with COVID more effectively and to deal with the economic fallout of COVID more effectively. The problem with that argument is I'm yet to hear anyone specify any area of regulation where that is in fact the case. It is a largely, in fact, wholly abstract debate. No one has as yet said, here are 3 regulations that we need to be free to change and we need to leave transition to do so. The second argument is we need to be out of the EU state aid regime in order to deal with the fallout, the economic fallout of the pandemic. The problem is that the EU state aid regime has effectively been suspended by the European Commission anyway. There is no prospect in the short to medium term of that preventing any member state, or indeed us, from bailing out businesses that have been hit by the pandemic. And the third argument you hear is we need to be out of transition so we can sign these trade deals with the Chinese, with the Americans, with whoever else. That is what is required to make our economy more dynamic going forward. The problem with this argument, of course, is that it's far from certain that many countries are going to be open to greater free trade post-pandemic. We simply don't know yet, but one potential implication of COVID-19 is it makes states more interested in being self-reliant when it comes to medical equipment, certainly, but potentially also when it comes to things like food than they were beforehand. So it could be that actually these partners that we're counting on to pull us through a post-Brexit sort of economic recovery will be less keen on trade than they were going into the pandemic. I think the fundamental case for not extending is political. And there are several aspects to that. Firstly, the USP of this Prime Minister is the man who delivers what he says on Brexit, and I think he's keen to keep that reputation. The second thing is there are people in number 10 who are keen to get Brexit done as far before the next election as possible. And here I have to say, I have never ever come across a new government as utterly obsessed with re-election as this one is. It is all they talk and worry about. And linked to that, I think there is a strand of thought that says, yeah, Brexit is going to be damaging. So why don't we hide the economic damage of Brexit under the economic damage of COVID? That is to say, if we leave without a deal in December, no one will be able to accurately say what the damage of Brexit was because the economic hangover of COVID will disguise it. That's not a wholly barking mad argument, actually. If you are one of those people like I am who thinks that COVID will change the way we do economics, firms will have to adapt to social distancing, to different sorts of supply chains, then bundling up the Brexit adaptation at the same time makes a lot of sense. On balance, I don't think that the case for not extending is stronger than the case for extending. What I would say as a final remark, though, is I think that pretty much in number 10, most people disagree with me. And that at the moment, there is no reason whatsoever not to take the government at his word and assume that the balance of opinion around the Prime Minister is to not extend and that we will leave transition at the end of December. Thank you.
Thank you, Anand. Yeah, I should reveal, I had asked participants to try to say something positive in their talks.
I forgot that, sorry.
We'll let you think about that for a minute.
Not in my nature.
I know. Okay, so next we're going to hear from Dr. Rick Whitaker, who is going to talk to us about what has been going on in the British Parliament in the past few years to prepare for Brexit, and also talk a bit about more recent weeks and you know, kind of virtual meetings and how those have been going in Parliament. So Rick, if you could be sure to unmute your mic.
Yep. There. So yeah, thank you, Lauren. Thanks for setting this up and persevering in the face of different circumstances. I guess this is becoming a slightly more normal way of holding a meeting now. Yeah, and I should also add that I might be joined by cats or children at some point during this talk. I'm not sure, but hopefully I'll get through it. Okay, so yeah, Lauren asked me to talk a bit about the British Parliament and how leaving the EU has impacted on the way it functions. I thought I'd say a few things, first of all, about what the relationship between Parliament and the Executive was like in the 2017 to 19 period. And in many ways, we saw a kind of resurgent Parliament, and this was largely because of the coincidence of minority government at the same time as parties being heavily divided on this issue. And this allowed Parliament to do things that, you know, we don't normally see it do. It's perhaps not true to say it's never done things like this, but certainly not in recent years. And so I suppose one of the important things that happened quite early in this process was the changes to the withdrawal bill that the government were forced into making by parliamentary pressure. And that included this meaningful vote on the withdrawal agreement. And of course, we then saw huge defeats, gigantic sort of massive defeats of the government on 3 occasions when the government was putting its withdrawal agreement and its political declaration on the future of the EU to Parliament. And then another thing we saw as well were 2 pieces of backbench legislation which were agreed and reached the statute book against the will of the government, which again is something largely unheard of in modern parliamentary history. So we have the Cooper-Letwin Act, which required the government to table a motion on an extension to Article 50. And then we had the September 2019 Benbour Act, which forced Boris Johnson into requesting an extension to the Article 50 process. We've also seen the use of these kind of previously very rarely used techniques like the humble address, which is a way of forcing the government or pressurising the government to release documents that wouldn't otherwise be there. And we've also seen select committees doing a huge amount of work on Brexit. Of course, now their attention is changing to COVID-19 largely. But some of the research that Phil Lynch and I did showed how the acceptance rate has been comparatively high for recommendations made by select committees on Brexit reports. But we found similar results to other research on this that showed that it's really when select committees are asking for smaller sorts of changes, they're more likely to have those accepted. nevertheless comparatively high acceptance rates. So yes, I'll say something about the transition period which we're currently in now, and it's important to note, I think, both positive and negative points. So I will get a positive point in there, Lauren, at this point. But on the negative side, what we saw from a Parliament power versus the executive point of view were changes to the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, which is now, of course, the Withdrawal Agreement Act, such that parliamentary approval for any extension to the implementation period isn't needed anymore. And also Parliament doesn't have to approve the objectives that the government sets for the future relationship, and Parliament doesn't have to approve any future relationship treaty. And so these are major changes that if we'd still been under minority government, we would have had huge battles over these. And of course, we're much less likely to see that now, because those powers have been stripped away from Parliament. But on the positive side, the European Scrutiny Committee, which deals with European legislation and sifts through it and tries to figure out which parts of it are significant and which we don't need to worry about too much, they have a significant new role, which is that they can sift through things that are coming through the EU legislative process during transition, and they can ask the government or require the government to give time on the floor of the House of Commons for a debate on a motion that relates to a matter of vital national interest. So if they decide that something coming through the EU legislative system, which now, of course, we can't block, is of vital national interest, then they can force the government into allowing a debate. And the same goes for the House of Lords EU Select Committee as well. So that's my kind of positive point about the role of Parliament here. I think looking forwards a little bit then, so the Select Committees, you might argue with those, we're kind of beyond the sort of Leave versus Remain divide, which Phil Lynch and I have looked at the sort of balance of those on select committees over time. But there are still lots of issues that they're going to look at which relate to the UK having left the EU. So there are 4 bills in progress at the moment that I draw attention to: the Agriculture Bill, the Environment Bill, the Fisheries Bill, and the Immigration and Social Security Coordination EU Withdrawal Bill. And those are all at sort of various stages of the legislative process in either the Commons or the Lords. Arguably, it's important to try and influence those early on, because a lot of them might delegate quite a lot of power to ministers to use secondary legislation to make decisions later on. So we'd expect interesting reports to come from the EFRA Committee, the Home Affairs Committee, and there are some big characters amongst the chairs of those. So Yvette Cooper on Home Affairs, Angus Brennan McNeill on International Trade. And it's worth saying that all the chairs of the departmental select committees are people who voted Remain. And that might make a difference to the level of tension between those and the government, perhaps. We also have this committee on the future relationship with the EU, which was the DEXU committee previously. And they're obviously looking in detail, and had Michael Gove in front of them earlier this week, at the progress on negotiations that are going on or not going on at the moment. A few points then about the future. It's not clear yet how Parliament will scrutinise this joint committee that is set up as a result of the withdrawal agreement. The government doesn't seem to be, as far as I can see, under an obligation to provide access to papers from that committee, or to provide updates to Parliament on its activities. So Parliament will need to kind of push to get access to those things now, especially if it wants access to documents when we're trying to reach trade agreements with other countries in future. I think it will, even if we don't have a deal or a very loose kind of a deal, it will be really important for Parliament to monitor what EU legislation looks like, because we'll have to make important decisions about whether we align or we don't align with certain areas of legislation. And there are various ideas around about how Parliament might do that. But I think given that retained EU law is being dealt with through secondary legislation, it looks in many ways like the executive has benefited from the UK leaving the EU, because quite a lot of the laws that have been transferred into the statute book that were previously given effect by EU laws are under the category of secondary legislation, where Parliament has a lot less ability to scrutinise what's going on. I think that's quite a significant problem for Parliament in the future. And I'll just finish then quickly by saying a couple of things about how Parliament's operating now. We have a new set of rules which allows Parliament to operate with members joining sessions remotely by electronic means, approved by the Speaker, to quote the rules on this. And the Speaker has the power to limit the number of members who are present in the chamber at any one time. At the moment, the technology doesn't allow all the MPs to take part in things at the same time. And we also don't yet have proper remote voting, but that's being decided on, and the procedure committee's looked at that in a lot of detail. It certainly seems quieter in the chamber, and PMQ seems to have a different feel from what I can gather, but I think it's going to take a while to get used to this new way of working. But I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Rick. We look forward maybe to hearing more in the Q&A about how scrutiny could work. You kind of alluded to that, but we'll leave that maybe for later. Now I'm going to hand over to Tim Bale, who hopefully is going to tell us a few of his thoughts about how Brexit, the lead up to Brexit, COVID-19, etc., have impacted the functioning of the two main parties. Tim, are you there? Can you remember?
I am, yes.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, I thought I would start really by talking about COVID-19 primarily, and do it in terms of the opportunities and the threats that it presents to both of the major parties. If we begin with the Conservatives, then there are some opportunities that COVID-19 presents the party. The first is to prove that they have a leader and a prime minister who can not only campaign, but who can also govern and can be trusted. And those were some of the doubts that I think the electorate, even some of those who voted Conservative in December 2019, had about Boris Johnson. This gives him the chance to assuage some of those concerns. COVID-19 also gives the Conservative Party a chance to finally, as they would see it, nail the lie that they don't care very much about the National Health Service and are more interested in talking about how much they love it than actually doing very much to help it in practical terms. That's something that the Conservatives have really been battling against since the late 1940s. And not very successfully, it has to be said. Their handling of this crisis may give them the chance to prove that they can be trusted on this, that the NHS, to quote Margaret Thatcher, is safe in their hands. There is also a chance, I think, presented by this crisis for the Conservative Party to push the reset button on some things that I think were possibly quite worrying after the recent election and into the new year. And that is its battle with the media, and particularly with the BBC. I think the crisis has shown that the BBC does play a very valuable role in British society. It is very respected, and we can see that from opinion polls coming out, in the last few days. I think the Conservatives are going to find it much harder, although they're beginning to slip into those old bad habits again, to criticise the BBC in particular and to criticise the media in the way that they had been doing, and in a way that I think set up a kind of very damaging, dysfunctional relationship. So pressing the reset button on that would be good. And obviously they get a chance to press the reset button on their supposed contempt for experts. I think it will be quite difficult for people to argue, given that the Conservatives are continuing now saying that they're relying on the science, that they no longer have any time for those people. There are smaller opportunities as well. I mean, one trivial one, for example, is the fact that nobody seems to be talking very much about Priti Patel anymore, perhaps because she's been quote unquote cleared, we're told in the Telegraph, by this inquiry. The fact that the internal inquiry had supposedly cleared her, I think would have been the subject for an awful lot of comment had this crisis not been going on. So it's hidden that fairly comfortably, I think, for them at the moment. There, I think, is also another opportunity, and this is a more important one, although it's in Priti Patel's field, for the government to rethink the immigration bill. I do think that this equation, if you like, between who is and who isn't a valuable immigrant based on merely salary as a proxy, if you like, for skill, was always going to be problematic. And I think that this crisis has shown that that's the case. Obviously, the immigration bill has been withdrawn. maybe for logistical reasons, but I think it maybe gives the chance for the government to rethink some of the content as well as the timing of that. And then even more broadly, if we're talking about policy, then clearly COVID-19 has reinforced the case for thinking about joining up social care with healthcare in a way that people have been calling upon the government to do for decades, really. This, I think, does give some momentum and some justification for doing that if the government chooses to go forward with that. And then lastly, in terms of opportunities, I mean, clearly the government has spent an awful lot of money and is still spending an awful lot of money. After the crisis begins to abate, it's going to have to think about how to actually pay for some of the spending it's done. And I think there may be a much easier case for the Conservative Party, both internally and externally, to make the case for tax rises as well as for action on spending to do something about that in a way that I think would have been ideologically, politically very difficult for it to do before this crisis. In terms of the threats, well, in some ways they're the kind of mirror image of the opportunities. Clearly, if any kind of post-mortem reveals that Boris Johnson was, quote unquote, asleep at the wheel during the early stages of this crisis, then that is going to reinforce the concerns I talked about earlier, that he's not very hardworking, he doesn't really have a grip on the detail, and that he is on occasion quite reckless. If the post-mortem finds that the Conservative Party has performed poorly and the Conservative government has performed poorly in terms of tackling this crisis, then it will reinforce, I think, suspicions about its stewardship of the NHS and its commitment to the NHS, particularly if that post-mortem, as I think is inevitably going to find, that the NHS was underfunded and, as it were, run too hot for years and years by a Conservative government bearing down on spending. It's also possible, of course, that the Conservatives won't choose to press the reset button on some of those issues that I talked about. And it's perfectly possible, given the kind of ideological instincts of the Conservative Party, that it will choose to deal with the debt and the deficit that has been built up because of COVID-19 through a renewed austerity. There are many people in the Conservative Party, and you hear them on the radio, day in, day out, when the question of how we pay for all this is raised, who do talk about there needing to be a reckoning and government needing to tighten its belt, and that's not just George Osborne who makes that point all the time. Philip Hammond and others have made that point as well. I think that could be politically very, very problematic for the Conservative Party should it do that. And of course, it may be the case that if it does not choose to reset on immigration, then it may have more problems than perhaps it previously would have done if it wants to emphasise its normal, rather restrictive rhetoric on that subject. On a positive note for the Conservatives, and you asked us to be positive in some respects, I think what any crisis does is to some extent reveal who's up to the job and who's not up to the job, and it makes that kind of sifting and promotion and demotion exercise much easier and much faster to do. So it may be that some people who weren't originally thought of as kind of front rank people will come through all the faster than they otherwise have done, and some of the dead wood will be cut away more quickly than would otherwise have been the case. For Labour then, in terms of the opportunities, well, for one thing, COVID-19 makes everything else before COVID-19 in some ways seem like a distant memory, and given that the Corbyn era was not very good for Labour, the effect of, if you like, historicising that period is, I think, very useful for the Labour Party. It also, of course, means that in a more trivial sense, the fuss about the leaks internal report that was causing the party so many problems, last week or a few days before that, is concerned, hasn't really been given the kind of attention that it would have been given in the media absent the COVID-19 crisis. that crisis also in some ways gives Keir Starmer a perfect chance to shine, because it plays to his strengths in that he is prepared to be constructive. He is, you know, to use the cliche, forensic, measured, etc. in terms of his style and his opposition. I think that will allow those qualities to shine through. The same, incidentally, applies clearly to some people in the shadow cabinet. And I was talking about the kind of demotion, promotion, acceleration effect of a crisis like this. But it's also true that, of course, because there's not much else going on at the moment in politics, then for anybody who's just joined the shadow cabinet, they have a perfect chance to really get into their brief without being needed to comment continually on it, as their predecessors might have had to do. There is also another opportunity, clearly, that some people are already talking about, in the sense that we are now a state that is spending an awful lot of money, which is active, which is engaged. And since Labour claims to be the party of the active, engaged state, and has always been prepared in some ways to spend more money than the Conservatives, then perhaps this sets up an environment in which Labour can flourish. That, though, takes me on to the threats. I think one threat is that Labour assumes somehow, as perhaps some people were guilty of after the financial crisis, that the facts of life had suddenly become socialist rather than conservative. And I think that's a real risk, particularly on the left of the party. And there is a risk that the party, as it were, overshoots on that and assumes that the public has more of an appetite for more state than is in fact the case once this crisis begins to abate. I think the threat to Labour is obvious, however, and that is that public opinion concludes, when all is said and done, that the Conservative Party, the Conservative government, made a reasonable fist of its response to the COVID-19 crisis, and therefore, to some extent, allows the Conservative Party to, you know, surf that kind of long-term gratitude to another election victory in 2024. I think it's too easy to assume that the very reasonable and justifiable criticisms, perhaps, of its response will necessarily resonate with the public. We can see already that there are, you know, some very major questions to be asked about the conduct of policy by this government, both during and before the crisis, and yet it doesn't seem to be making that much difference to public opinion on its handling thereof. Now, that could be temporary. It could be that any post-mortem shows up the government's performance as being much worse than other countries, in which case that may begin to seep through to public opinion. But at the moment, it doesn't look to me like that is happening. So to finish up on one kind of positive note for the Labour Party, we should always remember that absent the COVID-19 crisis, absent Brexit or whatever, that to coin a phrase, things can only get better. And given that 2019 was the worst performance by an opposition party in 7-8 decades, it will be hard to imagine that the Labour Party has anywhere to go but up.
Thank you very much for that, Tim, and especially ending on a positive note, at least for the Labour Party. Maybe not so positive for the Conservatives, but that's the British party system, isn't it? Okay, so now I'm going to hand over to Alex Wadden, who is going to talk a bit about the British government's social policy response to recent developments. Alex, could you unmute your mic, please?
Yeah, I think, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, great. Hello, everybody, and thanks to Lauren for inviting me to participate in this. Just I'm a sort of late addition to the panel. My analysis of Brexit doesn't get much beyond frothing at the mouth, but so I'm going to concentrate on the sort of social policy response to the COVID-19 crisis, but clearly I think that does tie in with issues, particularly in terms of fiscal capacity and the amount of money which is being spent, which will, and the economic issues around that and around Brexit as well. But in terms of social policy, I'm just trying to think about in terms of the protections which have been provided really in response to the economic catastrophe. Clearly the most important protection in some ways is healthcare. But I'm not going to really talk about that too much today. In as much as there's not been much policy innovation, there's been lots of ingenuity and creativity in terms of what's going on in hospitals, but there's not been much new in terms of policy innovation. I think the point Tim made earlier about the way the politics of the NHS might change a little bit will be a really interesting thing to look at in the longer term. Even in the last election, the Tories were trying to sort of adopt the NHS more than they had done previously, despite the previous 10 years having seen the slowest rate of growth in NHS spending in the NHS's history over that time. Now, clearly there are multiple issues raised by the lockdown, the consequences of the lockdown. As it is, I think it's pretty unforgivable that there wasn't a pandemic healthcare plan in place, but I'm more sympathetic to the uncertainty about how to deal with the extraordinary speed of the economic descent, which we've seen over the last few weeks. For universities, for example, clearly didn't have an off-the-shelf response to closing campus. So what are those issues? Well, to paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld, there are known unknowns and some unknown unknowns. I'm not sure how unknown they really should have been. On the known side, how do we protect people against loss of income when the economy closes down in such a dramatic fashion? And that's especially problematic in an economy such as the UK's, where so many people are already engaged in the already uncertain gig economy, as it's known. And an area that I think needs more explanation, I can't speak with much authority on, but in terms of what's been happening with homeless people and other really vulnerable groups. It's been interesting that there has been a response to that, and homes have been found in some ways, or at least temporary housing in terms of hotels and other things. Certainly, if you speak to people who are more expert than I am in this, they would have said these are problems which take 2 or 3 years at least to do anything about, and so doing stuff in 2 or 3 weeks is interesting, if not optimal. The unknown unknowns, though perhaps not that unpredictable. It's really exposing inequalities in the UK and place I know as well, in the US, even more so, sort of socioeconomic inequalities and the way in which they map onto issues of race and ethnicity. And another issue which has really come to light in the last few days is the chronic state of the care sector in the UK. And that again is something in some ways I think there's been some good journalism about that. It seems to me a little bit that some of the reason why the government suddenly started counting the figures of deaths in care homes is in some ways a response to some of the better journalism we've seen over the last few weeks. Okay, before reflecting on the answers that have been thrown up, it's important to take on board in some ways the fragility of the starting position. I don't want to come over all Jeremy Corbyn, and I really don't want to come over all Jeremy Corbyn, but the capacity of the state to respond to fiscal crisis is framed by a decade of austerity. And for all the rhetoric back in 2010, people certainly weren't in it all together over that decade. As I mentioned earlier, the NHS, the lowest rate of spending in 10 years. And while social care is a statutory obligation on local councils to provide statutory care, the decline in council spend, in grants to councils saw a dramatic decline in per person spending on social care of about 16% per person over the decade. That's not all to do with elderly care, that's to do with social care across all aspects that councils cover, but clearly a significant downside to where you start this. In the circumstances, though, in terms of the policy response, and I think it's pretty understandable that the response has been to throw as much spaghetti at the wall as possible and hope that some of it sticks. There's no precedent for what's happened in living memory, and there's this process of trial and error, but it's not sort of done on a sort of controlled experiment basis. It's just doing stuff and hoping for the best. I think hopefully most people are familiar with what the government has done. What's interesting, I think, about the UK government's response is it's been pretty massive in fiscal terms, major commitments, but it's been largely geared to keeping people on payroll in that context. So, and with government taking on the burden of that payroll if necessary, and rather than shifting people onto the benefit system, rather than sort of big increases in unemployment benefit, which has been a major policy response in the United States, has been a big expansion and an easing of eligibility for unemployment. The emphasis here has been on the job retention system, and the word furlough has become familiar to us all, and that's what that's all about. And then more laterally, the self-employment income support scheme. And in both contexts, the sort of headline is that 80% of the government will help provide 80% of pay or average reported earnings for the self-employed. Now, if you look in detail at what's happening, there are lots of ifs, buts and maybes about how this works, particularly with regard to the self-employed. Probably about a third of the self-employed won't qualify for that scheme. But by any standard, these are major commitments from the government. Projections about the final cost, the initial projection was, say, for the job retention scheme was about 40 billion. They're just speculative guesstimates, really, rather than sort of informed estimates, and they're likely underestimates, under guesstimates of what the final cost will be. And clearly, any post-Brexit life is going to be framed by having to accommodate that seriously diminished state fiscal capacity. Again, going back to how Tim's conversation about what happens next. Do the Conservatives go back to saying now we need austerity, or just sort of break the mould and suggest that government spending is something that needs to be maintained? So, but while the emphasis has been on maintaining payroll and maintaining people in jobs at least, it's less generous to people who've lost their jobs. Okay, so there's not been any major expansion of the job seekers allowance. There's been some increase in universal credit, so the standard allowance for universal credit's gone up by £20 a week for a single person over 25. There's been an easing of reporting and job seeking requirements have been suspended with regard to access to universal credit, presumably as much to do with social distancing as anything else. But eligibility hasn't become more generous in terms of the amount of savings that you can have. That's not shifted. So if you've got capital savings of over £16,000, you're ineligible for universal credit, and the amount you get is reduced from anything from £6,000 upwards. So certainly for perhaps households and couples where you've still got one person who's still earning, the chances of being eligible for universal credit are pretty slim. And one thing, but in terms of still the 3 weeks from mid-March saw 1.2 million new claims for universal credit, and that's probably gone up by about 1.5 million now, and that's about 10 times what you'd expect over that period. So clearly massive demand and all sorts of problems accessing it, but again, that's probably to be expected just given that the unprecedented demand. In addition, there have been some...
I'm sorry. Are you wrapping up?
I am wrapping up. I'm going to come to my positive point now. So there have been some freezes on credit card and car finance payments. I guess the positive point is from all of this is that we just don't know whether the government's taking the right path in terms of its emphasis, but certainly they have put the sums involved are quite extraordinary. And the negative thing, I guess, is that there'll be potential extraordinary consequences as a result of that.
Most definitely, most definitely. Okay, so I was going to talk to you a little bit about public opinion, and especially the issue of generational differences and generational change in attitudes, especially related to one of the biggest issues implicated in Brexit, which was public attitudes to immigration. But we don't have a huge amount of time, and I'm keen to take a few questions, especially for Anand and Tim before they need to leave very, very soon. So perhaps we can have another panel at some point, and I can talk about my public opinion-y stuff. If UK and a Changing Europe would like to invite me along, I'd be happy to talk about it there, for instance. But for questions and answers, if everyone could open up your chat function, the Zoom group chat, and if you could just type your own name and who your question is for, which panelist your question is for, and we will try to prioritize the questions for Anand and Tim. Any participants who want to ask questions, that would be great. And then I would ask you, when I call your name, to unmute your mic, and we're going to try to let you ask the question live. So Bledden already has a question. Bledden, do you want to unmute your mic? Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Can you hear me?
Yep. Great.
Excellent. Thanks to all the panelists for really informative presentations there. My question, I'm going to revert to type here and talk about devolution and the constitutional future of the UK. And I just wondering the panelists' thoughts on what Brexit was doing to the devolution situation in the UK, the constitutional makeup, and then what COVID has done to it, because my impression has been that Brexit was really undermining a lot of the devolution status quo, or weakening devolution settlements, especially, for example, the Welsh Government voluntarily giving powers back to London for Brexit implementation, especially in environment legislation, for example. But when we have COVID come along, it's happening in a policy area that is one of the biggest devolved areas, and we are still getting journalists in London now who still don't understand that Matt Hancock is not a UK Health Secretary. There is no such thing as a UK Health Secretary, and we've seen a raised profile, especially for the Welsh Government now, which is actually getting recognition from Sky News of all places. So I'm just wondering, where do you think that's going now? And also the Northern Ireland government is back as well. The politics of Theresa May's government is a distant, I don't know, nightmare or dream, depending on your point of view. So I'm just wondering, where do you think this is leaving the constitutional future of the UK, and hopefully not getting bogged down in the Scottish separatism issue, maybe just focusing on the union and the powers within the union as opposed to separatism. Thank you.
So I wonder, Anand, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with everything Blydyn said, that on the one hand, you have the central government abrogating powers to itself during the Brexit process, and on the other, you have this very strong image of Scotland and Wales in particular treading a slightly different path on COVID to the UK government. What I would say is everything that this government has said and done in the admittedly short amount of time since it came to power marks it out as one of the most centralised and centralising administrations we have seen across a number of different areas, whether you take it in terms of the Shared Prosperity Fund, for instance, where there was an obvious logic for devolving some of the decision making, not just to the devolves, but also to regions and even cities. The government has absolutely point blank refused to do this. I think the approach of this government to devolution in the broad sense, by which I don't just mean the devolved governments, but also the different regions of England, has been the central government will give out goodies as a result of which these people will be grateful, and that is our route to holding the union together. I don't think it crosses their minds that actually letting go of some of the levers of power might be a way of governing more effectively. And I'm not sure that will change, even if the experience of COVID indicates that that is something they should be thinking. I'm not doing very well on being positive and upbeat, I'm afraid, but I am working on it in my mind as I speak.
Well, to be honest, you were one of the panelists I had in mind when I was made it specific, but myself as well. It's partly why I was going to talk about generational differences, because that's actually a potentially positive message, which is, well, depending on your perspective, but you know, I've been doing a lot of research on this, including in the UK case, and especially in the case of the UK. What me and my co-investigators are finding are actually very significant generational differences. You know, this after following generations of people over time, which you have to be able to do to establish whether there really are these generational differences. And certainly, you know, in the area, I would say most implicated possibly for Brexit, the area of immigration, we are seeing significant generational differences that persist over time, and not just with the current generations. You know, it started with the people born in the 70s and 1980s and has continued. And, you know, that presents a prospect of drastic value change, slow, but drastic value change over time. But it also raises the question about, you know, okay, you know, we Brexit one way or another at the end of this year or sometime, you know, in the next few years. But the nature of the British public is likely to have changed very, very drastically within the next 10 or 20 years. So, you know, what what are our prospects for the future, for instance, if we as a public change our minds? Anand, do you have any answers?
Well, I mean, the one thing I would say to that is, and you know, this is all shrouded in uncertainty, is whether or not that generation or the younger generations, once we're out of the European Union and out of transition, and we're no longer talking about it all the time, whether immigration then ceases to be defined as an EU issue.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, whether actually that's a broader debate about immigration from people from around the world as well. And in that sense, it might be that, yes, you have shifting, I mean, you will have shifting opinions on immigration as you get generational change. But that might well not be couched in terms of, you know, whether we should be back in the EU or not. It might be a far broader one, because one of the interesting things that some survey work during the referendum picked up was that actually, yeah, many young people were overwhelmingly pro-Remain, but young people equally weren't obsessed by the idea of the European Union, because many of them have a more globalist than a regionalist perspective. So you're absolutely right on the values change, but whether that plays directly into an EU debate or something broader, I just don't know.
Good point. Good point. I believe you need to go. Is that right?
I'm afraid so. I'm very sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Tim. Thank you for joining us. Everyone else, if you want to stay, if you have questions for Rick or Alex or myself, we're happy to stay for a few more minutes. But again, thank you both very much for joining in.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, and stay well. Cheers.
Bye-bye. Okay, does anyone have any further questions for me, for Alex, for Rick? If not, I guess I have a question that I raised for Rick, if you're still there. You know, it's a question about something that Anand just mentioned, and you probably gathered from our email correspondence about this, which is the problem of this centralization, the centralizing government, actually, instead of taking back control for the parliament, you know, they're taking back control for the executive. And Rick, you mentioned some possible ways that Parliament could continue to scrutinize what's happening vis-a-vis Brexit and also the COVID-19 situation. And I wondered if you wanted to come back in and say a bit more about the other scrutiny techniques that can be used in the current circumstances.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Lauren. Yeah, I mean, I think at the moment we're back to what, in some ways, in terms of the parliamentary arithmetic at least, we're back to a more normal kind of situation for the UK at least, where we have a single party majority government. And so you wouldn't expect Parliament to be kind of dramatically powerful in that set of circumstances. But I think what we have seen is certainly a higher profile for select committees over time. And I think they're one of the places where if the government itself doesn't set up any decent structures to monitor EU legislation, then the select committees have the power to set their own agendas and try to launch investigations into areas of policy where divergence from EU policy might make a difference to particular economic sectors. And I think that given the amount of interest we've seen in recent years among select committees on Brexit, it's far more than it had been in the past. I think there's a fair chance that will continue, although most of my predictions seem to be wrong at the moment, but I think there's a fair chance that will be the case. And we'll see select committee chairs establishing as much information as they can about the consequences of divergence from particular policy areas, from particular rules that the EU have got set up at the moment. There are other ideas around. So at the very least, I think we'd expect some kind of dialogue between the European Parliament and Westminster. The European Parliament has called for an association agreement with the UK, and those normally include delegations of MEPs plus members of the relevant national parliament meeting periodically to talk about matters of common interest. And the political declaration on the future relationship also talks about a dialogue between the EP and the UK Parliament. So I think we're likely to see that. There are other ideas around the liaison committees. Inquiry suggested we might have one kind of European Union Affairs Committee in the Commons, which would monitor EU legislation. But again, the pressure for that might vary depending on how close a relationship we go for. It doesn't look like we're going for a particularly close relationship. And if what Anand said is right, you know, we might have no deal at all. There might be a pretty reasonable chance that there's no deal. And in which case we're looking more like Canada if we can get some kind of free trade deal in the future, in which case you have less parliamentary involvement in monitoring things, except for where committees have got the power to set their agenda themselves, which the select committees have got.
Thank you for that, Rick. We have a question from Sally. Sally, are you still here? You have a question for Rick? You could be sure to unmute your mic and maybe turn your video on.
I've just unmuted myself. I'll turn my video on as well.
That's brilliant. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. That was really great. Probably won't surprise you to know that someone like me who's very interested in the history of science policy and scientific advice to government right now, it's absolutely fascinating. And I've actually just been reading stuff from one of my PhD students about past use of governments as scientists as human shields. So I just wondered if Rick had any kind of thoughts about whether this might lead to significant changes about how governments use scientific advice, or the role of scientific advice in government, or the extent to which the government is, scientific advisors are embedded within departments, and how that might be affected, if at all, by what's going on at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think that it will probably depend on some of the kind of investigations after this is over on what the role of science was and how it was used, because we had those questions about Dominic Cummings being on that panel of experts and whether this is appropriate or not. And I think that kind of tension we'll see, I suppose, discussed heavily when there's some kind of investigation into what happened here. I mean, I guess the government would argue that, we'd had this kind of culture of despising experts and all that sort of thing in the run up to, or not wanting to talk to experts or hear their opinions in the whole Brexit debate. And I guess the government would try to argue that we're talking about things about which we've got more certainty and less opinion here, because we can try to establish causation more clearly in the natural science world than we can in the social science world. So it could be that they embrace expertise in science more heavily, and I think there's a fair possibility of that, but not in the world of social science. I don't hold up much hope for many changes whilst we've got this government in power on that front.
Thank you, Sally, for that question, and Rick for the answer. I don't see any further questions, and it's just past midday. If no one has any further questions, I think we will end the panel discussion, but thank you everybody for tuning in and listening and asking a few questions. And I guess if you could send me some feedback about what you think, should we keep doing these kinds of things, or have you lost the will to live? That kind of feedback, that would be very helpful. We're getting some thumbs up and some clapping, I think, with the Zoom hand signals. So thank you all very much, and take care and stay safe.